Saudi Records model and how we aim to help artists and communities retain ownership in the work that they create. So back in 2017, me and Uday obviously come from very different parts of walks of life. But after having a number of conversations, we both realized that we both have a very similar aim, and that was to provide a support structure to artists to release politically conscious, forward-thinking music that not only comments on the times that we live in at the moment, but also provides a counter-narrative to what, let's say, mainstream media press obviously kind of delivers out. How we're different is a question that I often get asked. And without going into too much of the mechanics around how record labels run, it's simple around ownership. So I'll give you an example of what happens in kind of mainstream India. And mainstream Indian music is essentially Bollywood. So what happens is a piece of work is created. Now, a song is split into two separate rights. A sound recording, which is called a master right, and the underlying copyright, which is essentially known as publishing. So you can have one sound recording of a track, but using the underlying copyright, i.e. the composition, which is the melody, and also the authorship, which is the lyrics, you can create remixes. And you can also license and sell that on to remake songs, which we obviously all know about. What happens traditionally in India is those rights are essentially bought off the people that have made them, often for not a huge amount of money. They're often paid essentially what's known as session fees. So a session fee is you could be a violinist, you could be a singer, you'd be hired, you'd be paid a set rate, you would go and do a piece of work, which is essentially work for hire, and that's it. That's your payment over and done with. What happens essentially in the rest of the world is the person who wrote that retains ownership in that copyright, which is important. And it's important why? Because there is a perpetual royalty that is generated from this art. And that can be passed down through generations, that can be, that essentially earns money every month, every quarter in royalties. So what we've tried to do at Azadi Records is set up a structure where the artists that we work with retain those rights. That's not to say that we don't have ownership in those rights, we do, but it's probably a quarter of what the artist essentially has. Is that financially viable? We're still to kind of find out on that at the moment. One of the challenges that we face is negotiating between good business and good ethics. So, and it's, again, something that we're still trying to figure out because in today's kind of business world, it's all about quarter-to-quarter profits. You know, we always hear about GDP or we hear about the stock market growth, you know, the perpetual need to increase profits. Now, I understand the way that a business runs, but what we're trying to figure out is how to essentially do this in a sustainable way. We think it's possible, and there are models globally that have shown this is possible, but we're trying to see if it's possible in the Indian economy, because comparatively to, let's say, Europe or the US, there's probably a tenth of the value of royalties that there are in India as compared to an iTunes stream in the US or a Spotify stream. So the money bit we're still kind of working on. We're kind of 2 years in, and we're coping right now, but as our artists get bigger and as the demand kind of gets bigger in that sense, bigger budgets are needed. So we're still trying to figure that a little bit out. The core is we essentially try to provide a support structure around artists to put out the music that they want to put out, the stories that they want to tell. So if you're not familiar with us, go check out artists like Prabdeep, Sidemot, TNS, Amr. We've recently signed a Kashmiri singer-songwriter called Ali Safuddin, which some of you might be familiar with. But I'm going to pass over to Uday and let him tell you about some of the artists that we work with.
So I handle the creative side of the label, which is essentially deciding which artists we work with and what stories we focus on. So the basic idea which drove us to form the label is that the stories from Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, Pune can't represent in the Indian music scene at large. There's just no way. So the basic idea how we select artists to work with is to find stories from communities which we don't hear about at all. So, for example, Prabdeep was an artist that we chose to work with because within Delhi itself, no one was talking about Tilak Nagar, not Delhi's newspapers, not like even in the streets itself. So the issues of substance abuse, of gang violence that were plaguing Tilak Nagar became a story for us to bring forward, which no one else was talking about. Similarly, with Ahmer, in a time where like Kashmiri artists are actively being hunted down, such as MC Cash, it became important for us to put that story out there. Um, these stories, like how we work with them, is also to bring a kind of journalistic integrity to these stories. So, I myself worked as a journalist for 7 years. So each time we put out a narrative through an album, it goes through extensive fact checking in terms of their experience needs to be authentic and be brought out in the most sincere way possible. So from our side, there's no censorship. It's just that when we put a record out there, no one should be able to question the authenticity of that experience. And another factor that comes into this is, and how we go around selecting artists, is to build trust with communities and recognize our own privilege when talking about their stories. So an example of this is Ali Safuddin. I spent 2 months in Srinagar, and I've spent over 2 years trying to convince him to come and work with us, just because of his distrust of what the Indian industry and Indian media represents to his people. And we have to be very respectful of that fact while approaching